When Resident Evil was released in 1996, it pretty much coined the term survival horror. But up until the release of Resident Evil, that term wasn't used a great deal. Nowadays, we have a far more fleshed out idea of what it means to be a horror game, but in the 1990s, the vocabulary was translated from terms which already existed. An example of this is Clock Tower, a Japanese game released in 1995, which today is referred to as one of the earliest examples of the survival horror game, but at the point of release, it was referred to as a point-and-click adventure game. By creating a new genre, I feel like Resident Evil actually distanced itself from the games which clearly had inspired it. But when you look at the history of games which led up to the creation of Resident Evil, it becomes clear that Resident Evil is just the first in a new iteration of the point-and-click adventure game. Before the games console boom, Japan was having something of a renaissance with microcomputers. The MSX, the various Sharp machines, and DOS machines like the FM Towns and the PC-98. Western adventure games were relatively popular on these platforms. It was adventure games like Monkey Island and King's Quest that had a far bigger impact on the emergence of the survival horror game, and specifically on the conception of Resident Evil, than was perhaps previously thought. I know Sweet Home exists, okay, but just bear with me on this one. If you want to look up the inception of Resident Evil, everywhere you look, it's Sweet Home. It's actually staggering how much Sweet Home is cited as being the inspiration for Resident Evil. And when you look into it, there are mixed messages regarding the importance of Sweet Home on the impact of Resi. Some sources say that Resident Evil started as a remake or as a sequel to Sweet Home. The director of Sweet Home and the producer of the first Resident Evil game, Takuro Fujiwara, has said in the past that he conceptualized Resident Evil as a spiritual sequel to Sweet Home. However, Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami said that he never had any intention of making a Sweet Home successor. To me, this feels like a party line. This is the kind of typical ring-fenced Japanese PR that I've come up against when I've researched other videos in the past. I do not believe that the inspiration for this game exists in a vacuum. The DNA of Resident Evil is far more diverse and goes back a lot further than Sweet Home. I think that the core Resident Evil experience can be summed up in a handful of bullet points. Exploring a spooky old mansion which turns out to be built on top of something bigger and scarier, being able to select a playable character, tank controls and weird combat, revealing a story by exploring, progression in the game being gated behind solving puzzles and finding items, inventory and resource management, and then different endings based on decisions that you made over those previous points. Now, I'm not going to speculate where Mikami got the idea for a haunted mansion, but in interviews he has said that he was inspired by both The Shining and by Dawn of the Dead. The spooky old mansion is a horror trope that predates computer games by a long way. It's a good setting for a horror story. It's claustrophobic, and it's also pretty economical. It's a small environment with a hard physical boundary. New areas can be discovered and unlocked, but they're all still in the mansion. It's no surprise then that a great number of horror games are all about exploring an old mansion, and if it's not an old mansion then it's another small location like a science lab or a museum or a hospital or something. Right at the beginning of Resident Evil, the player is asked to choose who to play as. This affects the story, it affects the items the player will have access to, and it affects the solutions to some of the game's puzzles. And this is where I can draw my first parallel with an existing adventure game. 1987's Maniac Mansion starts with a girl going missing and a group of kids breaking into a mansion to investigate. It turns out that this mansion is actually built on a secret lab where bad scientists have been doing bad science. At the beginning of Maniac Mansion, the player has to choose which character to play as. Each character has different skills and abilities which help out with the game's puzzles, and there are even different endings depending on the characters you chose and the decisions that you made. If there was an Resi, then I think Maniac Mansion is the strongest case for it. A lot of the features in Maniac Mansion would then go on to appear in Sweet Home. Other haunted house games did exist, but Maniac Mansion was released 2 years prior to Sweet Home, and it got a Japanese release on the Famicom. There is a very strong chance, or at least a conceivable chance, that somebody at Capcom could have played Maniac Mansion, and that could have easily inspired some of the features that would appear in Sweet Home. As the 3D era emerged, standards were slow to materialise. There was a lot of variety in these games as developers were trying to get a handle on the technology that was available to them. And I think this is one of the reasons why we start to see genres being crossed over and blurred. And the game which inarguably inspired Resident Evil the most is Infogrames' Alone in the Dark. The first 3 Alone in the Dark games were all released in Japan. They were released on the PC-98 and the FM Towns computers, and they also got console ports. All 3 of these games came out before Resident Evil was released, and this series is one of the genuinely few Western titles to ever achieve genuine success in Japan. In an interview with the French newspaper Le Monde, Shinji Mikami actually said that had he not played Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would probably have ended up as a first-person shooter. The similarities don't just end with fixed camera angles and tank controls. Alone in the Dark is also about 2 people investigating a spooky mansion after a murder. You can choose between 2 characters to play as you play, it's revealed that the mansion is actually built on a giant complex filled with all kinds of evil stuff. Resident Evil's producer and the director of Sweet Home, Takura Fujiwara, did admit that he also used Alone in the Dark as inspiration for how to make a horror game. It feels to me like Alone in the Dark was the boilerplate for Resident Evil. The influence of this one game is far more obvious to me than that of Sweet Home. Exploration is what plays the biggest part in the storytelling of the Resident Evil games. The story itself is pretty minimal actually, and the only way to figure it out is if you're willing to hunt down and read all these text documents which are scattered and hidden all over the mansion. This is taken whole cloth from Alone in the Dark, where all of the game's lore is discovered by reading old books and letters and diaries that you find around the mansion. Exploration is one of the only ways that you can discover the story. It's one of the only ways that you can discover the different endings. But if you didn't care about story, then there isn't really an incentive to go schlepping around this old mansion touching a bunch of filthy old books. Mikami knew this. He knew he couldn't just make a game about running away from zombies and schlepping around a dirty old mansion. And so he added puzzles and mysteries into the game to incentivize exploring the mansion. Puzzles form the bulk of the gameplay in Resident Evil. Most of the puzzles revolve around just having the right item in your inventory and using it on the right thing. The piano puzzle, I think, is a great example of an adventure game segment. You can tell that you have to do something with the piano. You find some music and then you jam it out. It then opens a secret door, and then you take the thing off the wall, but you have to put another thing on the wall, and then you have to put that thing over on that bit of the wall. It's this backtracking with a little bit of moon logic built in. It just feels like something from Monkey Island. It was these Peter to Paul style item quests that made me realise how much like an adventure game Resident Evil really is. These puzzles hark all the way back to Maniac Mansion and are present in basically all adventure games ever. If anything though, from game to game, the puzzles just got better in Resident Evil. In fact, there is a puzzle in Resident Evil 3 which I specifically remember being identical to a puzzle from Sierra's Shivers. Now, I'm not saying that the designers of Resident Evil 3 copied Shivers. I'm sure 2 people could independently have come up with that idea. What I am saying though is that the Resident Evil games were clearly being approached with the mindset of an adventure game designer. What Resident Evil does differently is it takes this one step further than most. Most adventure games let the player carry unlimited things in their magic trouser pockets, but Resi will only let you carry a set number of items. This is sometimes annoying, but this is really good. I would have liked to have seen this in some other adventure games. As the Resident Evil franchise has evolved over the years, the locations may have got bigger and the game may have leaned more into the action, but the puzzles and the adventure game themes have stayed strong. At this point, it feels like the Resi franchise is able to adapt any genre into its horror vision. We've got rail shooters, walking simulators, co-op action games, pachinko machines. I'd love to imagine what Resi could be like as an actual point-and-click adventure game with a full mouse-driven experience. All the elements are there. You could probably do this with a mod for the original game. How do I get a Kickstarter going for that? When I first played Resident Evil back in the 90s, my takeaway was that it was a really scary, really grueling experience. Replaying it recently, I have really appreciated it through the lens of it being an adventure game. If you've not played the first Resident Evil and have been put off by that, then maybe give it a go with this in mind. If you got this far, thanks so much for watching. For more videos about old PC games, then please check out my previous uploads. If you enjoyed this video and want to help support the channel, you can become a channel member now. You can also buy merch, and there is also a link in the description to our Discord server. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Alright, ta-da!